It's awesome to be here. It's awesome to be here during Denver Startup Week. And I'm really, really, really excited about this conversation with Brian. And so much to learn, so much to talk about. But let's just get started doing a little bit of an introduction.
Does this mean we don't have to use the mics? Are we good?
Do we need to?
Oh, okay, cool.
Are we not coming up? Do we need to talk? Okay.
All right. You turned it on already. Of course you did. How about if I just leave it like that? Good?
Do I need to do one of the testing 1, 2, 3s? Perfect.
All right. I'll also, just so you know, on the AV side, I'm going to get all wound up, and I'll definitely be louder as I do that. So just be prepared. Okay. Amazing to have you here. Welcome to Denver. We're thrilled to have you here.
Thank you. It's my
On behalf of the startup community, this is what we love, right? We've got David's whole job is to go around building startups, or helping to build startups, building communities, and particularly investing in all of the places that often get overlooked, which used to be Denver. I don't think so much anymore. I think the secret's out, so we did a good job. But it's awesome to have you bringing that perspective and experience here. So welcome.
Thank you. And it is one of the reasons that we're here. We've got about a half a dozen portfolio companies in and around the Denver Boulder area. And surprisingly, not surprisingly, but interestingly, a lot of them are in hospitality. And so I thought it made sense, and it's a really good match for us to be talking, given the strength of Evolve, the brand, the global footprint. And we'd just love to talk a little bit about, how'd you start? What gave you the idea?
Yep.
We know we have a little bit of shared history at a lot of other Denver-based former portfolio companies, exclusive resorts, and even Inspirato. But what motivated you to leave exclusive resorts and start Evolve?
Yeah, it's the leap question, right? Where you're, in my case, I was in my mid-30s. I had twin boys who were in pre-K, and a great job at a great company that I had helped to build. I was one of the first 10 employees at Exclusive Resorts. For those of you who are familiar with that company in Denver, had spent 7.5 years there. So I think there's really two answers to the question. The first one is, I was one of those people who knew that this was the thing I had to do. It was kind of like, I wouldn't say it was all my plan. It's always easy. The Steve Jobs speech where he's at the Stanford graduation, and he talks about you can only connect the dots going backwards, which is a really great speech if you ever YouTube it. It's true, right? We kind of do the revisionist history thing, and we link all the dots in a way that's seamless and beautiful. I wouldn't say it that way, but I would say I knew somewhere inside me that I wanted to put this shot on goal as a founder, a co-founder, and I got to a point in my life. It was actually kind of interesting because there were externalities here. One was the age of my kids. I knew that if I did it in the first 2 or 3 years of their life, that would be bad for me and for my marriage and probably for their upbringing and a number of other things. Also, we didn't know we were going to go through the 08-09 recession, the global financial crisis. And that global financial crisis was particularly well suited to take out exclusive resorts, and it became an all-consuming task to kind of navigate it. And so that didn't seem like a great time. So we got to the middle of 2010, and I got to this moment where I said, oh my God, if I don't do it right now, I might not ever do it. And if I wake up, I had that visceral moment of if I wake up in 10 or 15 years and I didn't do it, I know I'm going to wake up with that regret. I've been asked what my number one fear in life is. It's regret. And so that was a huge driver in and of itself. The second piece would be kind of the actual company. That would have gotten me to quit my job and start a lemonade stand, but why Evolve? That actually came from the experience of Exclusive Resorts. So that company was, broadly speaking, in the homes business, and one of the big takeaways for us, and as the name implies, it was a high-end luxury homes type of product. And for me, the biggest takeaway, and for my co-founder Adam Sherry, who was also an early employee there, was wow, people love homes. They're maniacal about staying in these homes, and it doesn't have to be a $3 million house. The things they love about it, when we did a lot of deep customer insight work. It was never the thread count in the sheets and how hot the hot tub was. It was I could go to the kitchen in my pajamas and make breakfast for my kids. It was, we could turn on the TV and put our feet up on the coffee table and watch a movie like we do at home. And that's what we wanted to do on vacation, but there's no good way to do that when you're staying at the hotel. And this is all, by the way, in like the early 2000s, right? First decade of the 2000s. And so, what do we call that? The aughts? And so, for us, I think the takeaway was the product is killer, but the industry's a mess. And, you know, there's a lot of inconsistency, there's a lot. So the thesis became, number one, it's going to be a mainstreaming category. People like this too much. It's going to happen more. Owners are going to want to flock to it. Guests are going to want, and consumers are going to want to flock to it. Mainstreaming will occur over the next, call it 10 or 15 years. Second thing, if that's true, then professionalization is going to matter more than ever before. Because we're going to have to meet the needs of these mainstream consumers. We're going to have to make it easier for these owners. That's going to have to, the bar is going to go up. And number three, if those two things are true, then we're going to be really well positioned if we could build a vacation rental management solution that allowed us to help with that professionalization, do it in a very asset-light, capital-efficient way, and do it in all these markets. Do it across geos, up and down price points, just be a really broad base of kind of easy access to professionalization. And that was quite literally the thesis when we were in Adam's basement. Now, what I'll tell you is from there, we flowed out to like 50 sub things, 48 of which were dead wrong. But I'm really grateful that the first three were right.
So the way I'd like to organize this conversation, just for everybody, I recognize that we're here to talk about culture. We will talk a lot about culture, but I think context is important to set culture. So I want to ask just a little bit about the industry, especially how the industry has evolved a little bit over the last couple of years, and then I promise we will get to lots of really great culture questions. But how did you focus? The 50 different things, you know, the thing that, you know, I always say as an investor that the scariest thing for an early stage investor than one line of revenue is two lines of revenue, because there's no way a startup can focus on more than one thing at a time. How did you focus and how did you start to winnow or prioritize those 50 things?
I love this question. Narrow the focus is one of the things that we are very focused on, sorry, but true. We're still focused on it to this day. I actually would argue that it was easier back then, and maybe that was by DNA. I think a little bit of it was we were not shot out of a cannon. We did not have anybody backing up a truck of money. We did not, we scratched and clawed, and I raised, you know, that was my job within our partnership to do that. And I mean, I think we closed our first seed fund or seed raise of like $350,000, which was like the min to clear anybody's check, right? They were like, promise me you'll get to 350, and it might have really been 325. And I swear there was 25 grand at a time in Starbucks all over the U.S. And so I think that focus, in a sense, kind of came naturally because we didn't have a lot of choice.
Yeah.
And what we really had to do was get out of the basement and validate. And so it really just became this like, we have to get homes to come on this platform, and we have to prove that we can access demand and book them. Yep. And if we can do that and start to spin the crank, we can go from there. And I remember distinctly going and sitting down in like some VC conference room and be like, look, it works. We had 5 bookings, you know, last month, which is, by the way, like $4,000 or something like that. But the unit economics are beautiful. It all works perfectly. So, I mean, I think that focus came a bit naturally. And I would argue actually it's harder now. Now that we have
money.
Yeah.
More money, more problems.
We have people and talent and opportunity, and the core business works. So what do we do now? And all of that, it actually gets more challenging.
So I think, you know, we forget how novel this idea was, right? Aside from a handful of like coastal communities or, you know, ski communities, the idea that you would go to St. Louis and rent an apartment, like that was just so foreign because we've been so programmed to rent a hotel. Talk about how the world, how the business particularly since the aughts, since some of the other big competitors have been in the space, how has it evolved? Because now on both of your sides, on the consumer side, but also on the property side, there are professionals, you know, definitely professional property owners, but like there are people who really like have flocked to this product over the last couple of years, and it's really started to grow and, you know, be welcome and not so welcome in a lot of different communities.
Yeah, so a lot there, but I would say what you just nailed and described is that mainstreaming process. It's consumers starting with, well, we were going to, you know, Breckenridge, where there isn't enough hotel inventory to support the tourism industry. We rented a house, we really liked it. Oh, look, we can do that in St. Louis. or what have you. And I think that what's been really interesting is we're still seeing these new consumers come to the space. And as they do, they are not, I mean, every startup, and David could probably tell us more about this than anyone, startups have these early adopters. And they're these amazing human beings who are willing to put up with all of your very worst crap and still love you and stay with you. They'll give you a lot of feedback and it's valuable, but they won't leave you. And categories have that same thing. And we had a sort of version of that. And then you, if you're lucky, you break through that part and you get to the meat of the market. And that's actually where everyone's like, yeah, I don't have time for this crap. You better deliver or I'm out of here. And I think that's what we were actually going through in the last 10 years. Interestingly, there's a few accelerants of that actually. Airbnb, by the way, deserves a lot of credit. They definitely accelerated the category. They're a partner of ours, not a competitor. We distribute all of our inventory on their platform, as well as sites like VRBO, Vrbo, Booking.com, et cetera. But I think that the sort of rise of that, call it online travel agency and marketplace model. The other thing that was going on the owner, what we think of as our owner partners, is that real estate values, y'all may have noticed, were going through the roof. And so, and as this category mainstreamed, I think you saw this interesting impact where folks were saying, I want to have a second home. I can't possibly rationalize that expense based on my own usage right now because I'm active in my career, I'm active as a parent, I'm active as a spouse, what have you. But if I can run it out, I can bring that sort of timing forward. And I actually think that the vacation rental industry or the short-term rental industry in many ways did for, call it second home ownership, what the mortgage did for primary home ownership 100 years ago. It actually brought the future forward a bit for those individual owners. Last point, the pandemic. I mean, when you go through a travel ban, which by the way was hellacious, and we can talk about that because it's a stress test of culture, but when you come out the other side and people could get out of their houses, it was incredible how much demand there was. Why? Well, number one, I just got out of my house for the first time in 3 months. I really want to get out of my house. Number two, but I don't want to get on an airplane. I don't want to go to a hotel. I don't want to go to a resort. I don't want to share amenities with anybody else. I want to have my own space. I want to drive there in my own car with my own people. And I want to stay safe relative to this scary pandemic, but God, get me the hell out of my house, right? That was the basic thing. And we saw that all over the country. And I think we know from data that we pulled, we are an example of one of those, the pandemic pulled the future forward type of things.
So that was my next question to talk about, so I'm glad you pulled. There have been so many industries where, particularly for leisure and business travel, the pandemic was a decimating event. How, maybe this starts to bridge a little bit into culture, but how did you guys survive through that trough? And do you feel like you've come out stronger or leaner or meaner as a result of some of the really existential crises that were placed on the business and on the industry as a result of the pandemic?
Yeah. So let's go there. This will be a good. So there's one of our 10 core values that evolve is communicate often, honestly, and directly, which is a great phrase, but it's a little mouthful, so we call it COAD. So at Evolve, you'll often hear people say well, COAD, Lauren. I'm looking at Lauren. We could have done better on that, or you did awesome on that, or whatever, but it's just kind of our code word for straight shooting. And I think this session's gonna work best if that's what we do, so I'm gonna tell you the gory details, okay? Deal? All right. So this thing hits, and it's a travel ban, and it's really, really bad for a travel business. And at first, it's a grief cycle. There's a bit of denial. Surely this will go away. This is early first few days of March. And then one day I walk in on Wednesday, whatever that was, March 11th, thinking it was going to be another day at the office, and by the end of that day I closed the office. Literally didn't know I was going to make that decision that day, but that's how fast the data was coming at us. And about 2 weeks later, realized our cancellation rate for forward bookings on the calendar for the next 90 days was at 92%.
Wow.
And I get the chills just thinking about that moment. And, then I'm on this call, and I will tell you honestly, I think like a lot of entrepreneurs, I'm wired to be, pretty resilient. I don't get down a lot. I get frustrated, and I'm a human, but there was one night where I came down from the guest bedroom that was doubling as the office, and my wife took one look at my face and was like, "Are you okay?" And I said, "I don't know." I don't know. Like, I just had this call with Rob, our CFO, and Brian Nolan, our FP&A, financial planning analysis. Like, there's a version of the math here that's just really, really, really bad. So what we came up with in partnership with our board was a plan to basically survive 2 years in a nuclear bunker. So we said there was a phased approach where we said, here's what we're going to do. We're going to take in phase one, which is like reduce the expense structure and get to a more scale, like a more durable place or a more viable place. We're going to bring in some capital, and thank you for them for doing that. They've been handsomely rewarded for that decision, and they deserve every penny of it. We're going to bring in some capital, and we're going to have a plan. And if we get to the phase two of the plan, we're literally grabbing two of everything, and we're locking ourselves in a bunker, because you got to put yourself back in that time frame. We didn't know how long this would last, how deadly it was, how long would it take to develop a vaccine. I mean, right, like, it took a decade to figure out vaccines in the past. I mean, it's a real, so anyways, you get it. It was that bad and scary, and that required a lot of communication as a company and all of the rest. But then what I want to tell you is 90 days later, the stay-at-home orders come off. Everybody wants to, like, suddenly it's game on. Now, this was actually, it's great news, but it's worse news because we had no idea it was coming. And so we had actually, again, reduced expense structure. We were in no position to handle what became 2 and 3 times the volume of contacts from our owners and our guests. You know, our owners were worried. They wanted to know how to handle this. The guests wanted extra assurance. So even relative to norms, the business became more operationally intensive. And I think that second 90 days was in its own way every bit as hard as the first 90. Yeah. But 180 days later, we kind of got our heads back above water. And since that time, have had a pretty epic run. And then to your last point, David, unquestionably, we are a stronger company for it. I'm proud to say that we've always had a very, what we call a durable growth mindset. We've been very disciplined as operators of the business. We've never really had the luxury of having all the capital to burn thoughtlessly. I would actually say that's a terrible thing. It's not a luxury, but personal bias. But what I would tell you is, like, from a culture standpoint, there was a clear, like, we had been talking about this stuff for 8 or 9 years. Yeah. And then it actually got put to the ultimate stress test. You could not in a lab have devised a better stress test. And it was this moment of, oh, all this stuff we've been talking about is real, and it actually held up.
Yeah, and 60 to 0 to 100. Right,
and you just, like, you came out of it going, oh my God, well that means that if that didn't do it, nothing will stop us. So it was this, like, amazing feeling of momentum, actually.
So I want to come back to the good stuff, but I want, just for, given the topic of culture.
Yeah, let's do the bad stuff. That's
we'll just, what was that all hands meeting like when you didn't know what was happening, you're shutting down the office, and then just to look a little bit ahead, how did you lean on your culture to help influence that conversation?
Yeah, so the first thing that I think of is it was also me getting used to trying to lead what at that time was, call it a 400-ish person company, by looking at that little dot at the top of my laptop and trying to pour whatever is in myself into that dot. And I had never done that before, and I am, like, as I tell my team all the time, like, I'm a communicator, but I'm not an actor, right? Like, I just, like, all I know how to do is be myself. I know how to play one role. And so it at first felt really, like, I just remember that visceral feeling. And then I also remember, a couple moments, but the first was we made this decision to close the office, and that was something I think I shot that out as an email. We weren't even on Slack at the time for some reason. That'd be a Slack today. And then it was, we were kind of, like, trying to just scramble operationally. Because, by the way, what we're trying to now do is, like, book these properties from people's living rooms, and we don't know, like, is the IT infrastructure going to hold up, and what does PCI compliance for credit cards look like? And, like, we were kind of operationally focused at first. And I remember saying, I'm going to check in with you every Friday and tell you how it's all going, because we thought that we'd be back in the office in 3 weeks, right? And it was about a week later that finally the team came to me and said, everyone needs to hear from you. And I remember just sort of sketching out, like, an outline on a note card And then I just sat down in this chair in my house and put the thing on like a coffee table-ish thing like this and was like, and I just talked for 45 minutes, and I swear I don't know what I said, but it was just whatever was there. So to your point, what was I leaning on? I was leaning on all of the culture, and in particular what I was leaning on was the value that I just mentioned, Cohad, and knowing that we had committed to each other as teammates that we would shoot each other straight, that, you know, we would put it on the table. I know the team can handle it, whatever it is. And by the way, you know, I've been at this a minute, and what I can tell you as a leader is, like, for those of you out there who are leading teams or thinking about leading teams, like, I promise you that if you think it's an open question, it's 10 times much more discussed than you think. And I promise you that the narrative that gets formed in different pockets of the company by well-intentioned, awesome humans is likely worse than the reality. And so you're just always better off just saying, hey, if I'm you, I'm wondering the following, and here's the answer, so that you're actually operating off of real facts, and so that you know where I am. And if you do that enough times over and over and over again, and people know that you're always going to do that, then I think trust can develop in that sense. So that's what I did. I will also say, though, I mean, that first conversation was kind of like, here's where we are, and we don't know a lot. The conversations got progressively tougher from there for the next 6 weeks. And among the toughest I've ever had to have in my career. And I think that you know, that value, though, of Cohad, along with things like care, along with our commitment to hospitality as an organization, all of that became really I call it the infrastructure and the architecture of the culture, but for me at that time, it was like the crutch. It was like the thing that I leaned on and held me up, and I think held us up, which is why I'm such a believer that there has to be a certain amount of that, like, teeth to culture. It can't just be this, like, it's organic and awesome and dynamic and fun and cool and right, like, that's great. And on the fun days when the sun is shining, it's going to be awesome. But man, when the pandemic shuts down your business for 90 days, that's not enough to get you through.
I was going through your website, and I loved a lot of the things that you guys, you hang your hat on for culture. Things like taking risks, staying hungry and being humble. I love that, try to have fun along the way. That had to proceed, like that had to be a day one kind of phenomenon. Can you talk about how, you know, what foresight for you and Adam it took to start that way, how hard it's been to hold that line, you know, because as you get bigger, like, let's just, you know, stop being evil. We're going to cross that one out. You know, like culture
Like,
tends
not
to
that
evolve.
evil.
Culture tends to evolve as companies start to scale. As you start to scale, and you know, where we've seen at the seed stage, where founders start having that phenomenon is where they stop knowing everybody's name.
Yeah.
When the company meetings can't happen in the same, you know, you have to go to a hotel or to a ballroom and have a big company meeting. How do you hold that culture? How do you maintain that integrity? You know, because it had to start and it also has to evolve. But how do you hold on to that?
It's the question. Thanks for posing it. Let's start with the beginning, like the why behind starting with culture. And Adam and I truly were in his basement in central Denver, right near Rose Hospital, for those of you who know it. And we were debating the culture of the business, and we were debating it like rigorously and heatedly, and
alongside the strategy and like these were like as you guys are having your planning
right
and
alongside.
That's
I mean,
critical.
we're sitting
That's
there
so cool.
in this, and like it was in his kind of guest bedroomy office thing where, you know, when his mother-in-law's in town, she'd sleep there, and he had this big desk. And he told me he had us all set up. He had this like TV tray that was like the size of, I mean, and a metal folding chair. I'm not kidding. This would have been an upgrade, these plastic chairs. He's like, yeah, here's your spot. And I was like, what the, you know. And we're sitting there, and just alongside, and I'm so glad you pointed that out, we'd spend 2 hours on, you know, unpacking the data in the industry and the research. And then we'd like spend a couple hours on the model and the Excel file. And then we'd build 2 more slides in the pitch deck. And then we'd get into this debate about culture. And that would be like a day in the basement. And I think a lot of people would look back at that and say, like, you're out of your minds, right? Like, this thing doesn't exist. You don't have any customers. You don't have any employees. The culture is literally in this room. And by the way, all this other work that you absolutely need to have done to get out of the basement is not done. And so like, maybe you should start there. And if I could go back in time, I would tell you I would mix shift towards the culture stuff. All the time I spent, worrying about whatever, this term and this seed financing, this input into the model, how much is a square foot of office space, how many leads, all of it was just completely made up, and I don't remember what any of it was, and all of it got validated or disproven very quickly and adjusted and iterated on. But the work we put into the culture is actually still, I believe, why I'm here today. And so, I think it's that important, and what I can now tell you, and I will acknowledge that this is like me doing the thing I just said, connecting the dots, going backwards. Here's what I know now, because I have 10 years of experience in having seen it play out. Of all the things happening in that basement, culture is the primary determinant of future success. It matters more than all the rest of it put together, because if you get this right, you can fix all the other variables in the equation. It's also the only one. You've all heard of like an effort impact analysis, right? Like an XY axis. This is like a impact control analysis, right? It's the highest impact, and it's the only variable you have complete control over. Nobody else gets to have a vote. It's only up to you. That is such a cool phenomenon, right? It's like you get to do it, and then you get to decide it and iterate it, and your teammates join in, and no one outside of Evolve ever gets to have a vote. And what I think about now with 10 years of experience, and by the way, we've got 1,000 teammates now, which is a pretty wild milestone that we just hit. And I think about the difference between now and then, and the answer is nothing. It's still the biggest determinant of our next 10 years of success, or less than. And it's still just the 1,000 of us that get to decide it every day with how we do everything we do with each other, with our customers, with our partners, et cetera. And so I would just tell anybody out there thinking about starting a company, this is Denver Startup Week, like, based on my experience, start with that. Make it a part of your business plan, because it's every bit as important as the rest of it. Yeah. Okay, so that's like thank you for my little soapbox there, but like, please do that, it's amazing. Let's talk about how it holds up, or go ahead.
How hard, look, when you live and breathe that, it becomes the test, the touchstone for good employees, bad employees. Recruiting is really hard. Do you sacrifice, you find the developer, the CMO, but they're not going to fit the cultural, rubric.
You pass every time.
Every time.
You have to pass every time. That's the trick.
And is that a leadership thing, or is that a credibility thing in front of the rest of the company culture?
It's both, but here's what I would argue is, so this actually gets right at your question about how does it or not hold up over time.
Yeah.
The way I think about this is our job, and really I'll make it more personal, my job, I think this has to be led, and if you're going to be the co-founder and CEO of the company, and that means it's your job, is to draw these edges. And the edges are things like the values, things like your mission, your vision, our commitment to inclusion, our commitment to hospitality, right? And you want to develop language and frameworks around these things. And by the way, those things can iterate and tweak and change over time, but they're relatively static, right? They don't change often, and if they do change, it's a big deal. You make a big deal out of it. Your job is to draw the edges, and then, I think, get out of the way of your team and let them do whatever they want in between those edges. And most importantly, be themselves. Be themselves. Do not come in here and act like me. Don't assimilate, right?
Yeah.
Be yourself, but it's got to be in the edges. And so if you recruit that amazing developer who is actually operating outside the edges, you have to recognize what you just did was you just moved the edge. You just weakened it, you just changed it. And if you do that and you don't, look, sometimes you make mistakes. Sometimes you realize, whatever, okay, this isn't going to work. But if you realize that you see it, and by the way, by the time you see it, everybody else already knows. Let's be super clear about that. Yeah. If you don't correct it at that moment, then you have basically just seeded the culture, meaning, CEDE, to that person, and you have just weakened what you're building. And it's essentially, and it's hard because you're right, there are these times of, you want to always play the long game, but sometimes the short-term move is necessary to play the long game. But I would argue, I'd rather make short-term moves on any other front then sacrifice culture. I think once you do that, it's a slippery slope, and ultimately you end up with one of those stories. Have you all heard the story? That great company where 25 or 50 people were in one big space and they had this amazing culture and everyone was on the same page, and they managed to only hire culture fits, but nobody actually knew what that meant. And then the company started to actually succeed and get bigger, and then it got super corporate, and then they lost the culture.
Yeah.
Y'all heard that story, right? I mean, the reason for that in my mind is because they never architected the culture for scale and for change, and because they didn't actually think about those edges and how to reinforce them when the pressure was on to recruit and grow and scale.
What's changed? What's been added to that? So I want to know, how do you guys demonstrate the culture, right? Like I've been told that if you walk into companies and you don't see the culture on the wall, you don't see it in, on t-shirts, on jackets, it doesn't exist. How do you demonstrate it? And then how have you augmented it? How have you either added or removed major cultural tenets?
Yeah. So I'll start with the early days and just a quick sort of and I think of it as how do you operationalize, right? I meant to say this earlier, but you just poked right at it. I think that when you're architecting a culture, and I should have said this earlier, just so y'all know,
It's my fault.
I don't.
It's my fault. Bad moderator.
No,
didn't ask
you're
the right
doing
question.
an amazing job. I should have said this earlier, which is I just want y'all to know, this is a subject of great passion and things I've literally got 10,000 hours of thoughts in my head about. I don't think we have it all figured out. We're a work in progress. We need to keep improving. We get better every day. I hope some days maybe a step back and then two forward. All the rest. And I don't think Evolve's culture is right for every company by any stretch, right? So just so we're all clear that I'm just sharing my experience. Okay, early days, we would every Friday afternoon, we would have the whole company, which is less than the number of people here, would pull up a chair, kind of like this, and crack a beer or whatever, and it was our kind of town hall. And in the early days, I mean, you got maybe a couple of business updates, but the reality is it's a group therapy session, right? You're kind of how crazy are we? We're not that crazy. This has got to work. I mean, you're literally listening to people talk each other into, shouldn't it professionalize? Shouldn't this matter? Oh, yeah. And so we started this habit where, I don't know if it was every week or maybe every other or whatever, but we would pick a value off the list and we would just start talking about it. And we would literally just go around a circle and say so what does earn it mean to you? What does build loyalty one interaction at a time mean to you? What's an example of that? Where does it resonate in your life? What's a company you've seen do it well? Where have you seen that fall out? How did that make you feel as a customer or partner of that company, right? Just kind of very loosely, organically populating this stuff with meaning, which was cool. And then we got bigger and we're okay, we can't do it all together with 50 people, but we'll break into groups of 10 and do it because we still liked that exercise. And then you get bigger and and now you've got things on Slack, there's a value at channel where people can kind of tag their teammates and say nominate them for a value recognition. And there's all sorts of there's high fives, there's all this sort of operational infrastructure of how you do these things as you keep scaling. But I think it's just critical that you keep talking about it. And also, I lead an all hands meeting every month. I'm not the only one who speaks, but I host it. We never make it through an all hands meeting without tying out what we're talking about to our core values. So I think you have to keep breathing life into them and operationalizing that over time.
Yeah.
Your other question, if it's okay.
Yeah, what added, yeah.
Yeah, what was added. I'll give you a really good example that really struck home for me. This is another one where I get the chills thinking about it. So I would say that within our culture, inclusion, broadly speaking, was always in there, but it was, I now recognize, too implied. It was kind of within everything, and it was within us, but I think that over time, and in particular with the murder of George Floyd, the events of the summer of 2020, the change in the conversation, a much needed change in my mind, in this whole country, in the whole world, around social justice and race equity and all the rest, it brought to the surface that it was not explicit enough within our culture. And I'll give you an example. This is kind of a gut-wrenching story, but I just said it's co-ed and that's what we're here for. We had an inclusion and community behavior policy, which basically said we're a hospitality company. All are welcome in our homes. that has to be true. I mean, that's just what we do. That's who we are. That was an authentic expression of who we are. And I'm meeting with lots of different teammates talking about all of this stuff. And what I hear is, well, I was on the phone with this owner, and they said the following awful thing that no one should ever say. And I knew it was a violation of our policy, but what I didn't know was what I should do about it, how I should act in that moment. I hadn't been trained. It was a jarring, alarming, upsetting experience for me. And then this one killed me. And I know we're trying so hard to hit this number by the end of the year, and I didn't want to be the reason that we didn't. I could burst into tears right now as I tell the story. And I was just like, stop everything. We don't do anything until we figure this out right now. And how do we go about the business of, number one, operationalizing every aspect of that policy. Number two, pulling all of this to the surface, shining the brightest possible light we can on it, and doing what we always do when we find opportunities, gaps, moments of challenge, things we do wrong. You just got to pull it to the surface and talk about it. I call it shining the bright light on it, right? And did that as a company, and I think it really changed the trajectory of the business forever in a way that was ultimately really positive. And I think it's a great example of like, I'm so convicted that your moments of your greatest challenge and hardship in your life and your career double as the moments of your greatest growth and development. I want to be super clear that that does not mean that they're like fun and enlightening in the moment. They suck, and they're grueling, and they're hard, and they involve a lot of like, self-doubt, and I don't want to sugarcoat it. But I will say, when you look back, whatever it may be, I think you'll all kind of agree. It's like my growth and development personally as a leader, ours as an organization, it all correlates to when things got the hardest.
Culture only matters when it costs, right? Like it's easy. The Martin Luther King quote, it doesn't matter where a person stands during times of comfort and convenience, but during conflict and controversy does your true self really come out. You open the door to DEI, and I'm really like that example. You operate a marketplace, right? And so you have property owners that have a much less emotional tie to the business than do like the employees. How do you that was a negative sell on call. This owner did not fit the culture that we've demonstrated.
Yes.
How important is it to those property owners? How do you sell that to them as a reason to be in the Evolve network? And does it resonate with them?
Yeah, I mean, I would say this. First of all, it's not optional, right? It's like, this is the product. Like if you want to partner with us, bring your home onto our platform and have us market and book your home under our brand, there are certain brand standards, some of which are things like it's got to be safe, and it's got to be clean, and it's got to be ready for guests' arrival, and it's got to be as advertised, right? We go validate all this stuff in the onboarding process and whatever, and this was the big, one of the big learnings along the way was, and here is our inclusion and community behavior standard, and like, it's not optional. Now, we're happy to answer any questions you might have, and we're happy to, to sort of walk through it with you, but we're not negotiating about this. So that's number one. Number two, it's been really interesting. I would say that 9 out of 10, and truly 9 out of 10 times, that we have a conflict on this point with an owner, it is something that they just did not realize. It is unintentional. It is a kind, well-intentioned person who doesn't understand in that moment whatever it may be, how that might be perceived by somebody with a very different lived experience than theirs. It's that simple. And by the way, I think that's kind of like true of all of our society and culture, right? And I think it's actually one of the reasons why it's so important to me that our teammates can be who they are, because that means that as new people come into our business and sort of add whatever it is they want to add, their brushstrokes, their words, their numbers, their self in these edges, then we get better, we get stronger, we learn and grow and develop as a result of that. And so I will also say though, every once in a while, and we've operationalized this thing to the nine. Like, there's a level 3 violation. That's we don't, like, we're done. You're cut off. That's that. Again, nothing, no amount of revenue, no amount of growth is worth compromising where these edges get set.
That's awesome. Yeah, so I want to make sure we have time for questions. If people have questions, I want to make sure. I guess my last sort of official question before we get to the fun questions. You're a big man on campus now, big person on campus now, as a cornerstone of the Denver tech, the Denver hospitality ecosystem. How do you drive bigger change and bigger culture beyond the doors of Evolve into the ecosystem, into the community, so that we have this term at Rise of the Rest, we call them tentpole companies, the companies who stand up and stand out as like exemplars of what's possible, of great magnets for talent, of great opportunities for wealth creation. You are now that. How do you? What is your responsibility to stand up and hold up your part of the Denver Big Tent?
Kind of a gulp moment, David.
Well, you've been giving me goosebumps all afternoon.
I'm dead serious. So, first of all, I think it is absolutely my and our responsibility to do what you're saying. I hadn't heard that term tentpole. I love it. I'm going to steal that from you.
It's trademark. But you can,
perfect.
We'll send you lots of opportunities to
perfect.
use it. You're definitely able to use it.
I think, I would put it this way. I think that is our responsibility. I think we have to be stewards, so to speak, of that. And I think we're only at the beginning of our journey, so I'm really looking forward to this part. And to be honest, like, that's why I'm here today. That's why we've been trying. We've got an awesome team. They may be right over there. They are trying to get the word out, and you've actually tapped into one of my, this is one of my personal goals for this year, and kind of as I think about next year, is to do more public thinking, public facing, sharing of our experience. Not again because it's perfect, but because I hope that there's something that people can take from it. And because people did it for us, right?
Yeah.
I truly believe that it's our obligation to pay it forward. And I think that what that looks like, I hope, and I'll give you an example of somebody who did this for me. What I hope that looks like is a permission slip to take this type of approach to company building. Whether it's the culture approach, whether it's the durable growth approach instead of the not durable growth approach, whether it's whatever. I think we've built Evolve in a way that is different than the pattern of how a lot of companies that get to our scale and size get built. And my hope is that becomes a validation point that you don't have to play the game only in the way that kind of classically got described in like the blitz scaling Silicon Valley type of mentality. I think that there's another way to do it, and I'm hopeful that we could be one of the proof points, because ultimately, and I'm really interested to get your reaction to this, like, I look at the way ecosystems develop for startup and entrepreneurial activity, and I think about it as talent and capital and then proof points.
Yeah.
And the more that you get better talent, the capital, like capital markets are relatively efficient. They'll find you. Right? They found us. I mean, we couldn't raise a dime from a traditional VC. I mean, Sand Hill Road hated our company. Like all the VCs in Silicon Valley hated our company. I think they hated me, to be honest with you. But T. Rowe Price, of all things, one of the largest growth equity investors out there, ends up leading a round of financing that was like a total of $1.5 million. I mean, it was bananas what they did. Capital will find you, and then if you get to these proof points, guess what? The talent's going to get drawn in, whether that's to a category, to a city, to the act of entrepreneurship, whatever, right?
Yep.
So that's kind of the flywheel.
Yep.
And I think, my great hope is that we are going to be able to kind of contribute our version of that data point and that proof point and say it can happen another way. But honestly, I think we're at the beginning of that. Like, because it was not like pre-pandemic, we were kind of like, I mean, I'll give you all a stat. So pre-pandemic, I'll finish the sentence. We were kind of struggling, not struggling, we were growing, but we were like, it was choppy. we got pretty far on a lean infrastructure. We had a lot of work to do. There's a lot of stuff. Then the pandemic damn near kills the company. Then we come flying out of that curve, go through what I just told you. It's only now that we're kind of in the part where it's like we could get humans together in a room, tell stories, and actually say things like, by the way, we've got 1,000 people in the company, like I told you.
Awesome.
750 of them have joined since March of 2020.
Wow.
Right? Like we've got 25,000 properties active on the platform. We're going to have added 10,000 this year. That was the size of the whole company at the start of 2019. So we're kind of this like overnight sensation 10 years in the making. And I think it's right now that we have to seize the opportunity to do what you just, I took it as an appropriate way, challenged me and us to do. And that's what we're trying to do.
You asked my thoughts on that. I will, 2 words for my thoughts on that. Steph Curry. Before Steph joined the league, nobody was taking 3-point shots. He became the standard bearer, hitting and making 3-point shots. Since he's joined the league, more 3-point shots have been attempted than have been attempted in the history of basketball. He changed the culture and then changed the game by changing the culture. I think you can do the same thing with I think culture, corporate culture can also change the game.
Yeah.
And I think it's a really interesting phenomenon. I'd love to hear some of you guys' questions.
Yeah, excuse me, 2-part question here. So culture is obviously really big right now, and I think more and more companies are appreciating the impact. Even 10 years ago, I would say that focusing on culture would be perceived as pretty progressive. And knowing the CEOs that I've worked with, it's all about ROI. And people programs do not deliver an immediate ROI. So when you were going back to the founding of the company, what experiences did you two have that really drove the focus on establishing that culture initially, prioritizing it? And then subsequently, how has that culture positively impacted the fundraising over the course of the last 10 years and the conversations with the VCs?
Yeah, great question. Patrick, right?
Yeah.
Thank you for the question. So first of all, experience-wise, I would say I had never been, and this is not a shot at any company, I loved my time at Exclusive Resorts. I'm not just saying that. I was really proud of what I helped to contribute to there. It was objectively not a place where we did this with a lot of intentionality. It wasn't intentional and deliberate the way, and I learned that lesson. It was one of the companies where, man, that first 50, 60 people in that company were like aligned like this, and then we started to scale really rapidly, and new leadership came in, and we had people in different offices, and and I think we found ourselves, it wasn't like it became a bad culture, but I think we found ourselves, I reflected on it as searching for that, wanting that, like not knowing how to, like, we found ourselves using this term, like, well, you'd get out of these, you do debriefs about people that you'd interview in recruiting processes, and people would be like, I thought that she was a culture fit. Well, I didn't think she was a culture fit. Well, what does that mean, right? So I think there was part of that, and then, by the way, the 08-09, I mean, the 08-09 great financial crisis was the pandemic of that company, right? It was like, and so I think, again, you used an incredible MLK quote, so it's like you almost never ever say anything after a Dr. King quote. But one that I am fond of is that adversity doesn't build character, it reveals it. And I think that what it showed at Exclusive Resorts at that moment was that, we had a ton of character, but we didn't have our handle on exactly what. So that was one of the experiences. I said earlier, I wanted to say somebody who did this for me. I very sadly never got to meet him. Tony Hsieh, the longtime CEO of Zappos, wrote this book, Delivering Happiness. And he wrote that book and was leading on this topic from probably 2001 or 2 until 2009 or 8 when he wrote the book. And I read that and was like, holy shit, this person is willing to say this? Like, I know he's being ridiculed by investors and whatever. I know that people aren't taking this seriously, but it inspired the hell out of me. And I just said, this is what we want to do. Now to your last piece, I am now completely convinced that I can make the argument that culture is not an offset to the business performance or the ROI, the bottom line. It is the pathway. And for me, what I've realized is every great customer experience starts with having the right team. So when we draw the flywheel of our business, sort of the operating framework, we start with the Evolver experience because that allows us to have, I hope, to recruit and retain the very best team. That delivers the best customer experiences, and ultimately that delivers durable growth. And guess what? That's what fuels that Evolver experience, because as great as culture might be, if we're not able to take, if we're not going to go build something meaningful and category defining, then we're not going to keep the best people. That's, our best people are high performers. That's what they're there for. So I hope that helped. A couple good ones. All right,
Right here,
nice.
up front.
I'll shorten up my answer. Sorry. That's a really good question.
Question on values. You've mentioned Cohat a few times.
Yes.
And how much your employees embrace that and own it for themselves, use that language with themselves. What are the things that you've observed about the ability to create that environment where your values are really, truly something that your employees live and breathe and model for you rather than the slides on the wall?
Yeah.
Companies, it's a slide on the wall.
Right, and it's because what you're pointing at is what gets rewarded, because you could put the words on the wall, and if, the opposite of Cohat is like being passive aggressive, right? Also like my least favorite human attribute. And if that's what gets rewarded, and by the way, let's do this real fast. What's rewarded mean? Sure, you get a promotion, you get a raise, you get formal recognition, but there's also like rewards of who do you go to for questions? Who, who is it whose name gets remembered and said, what gets laughed at? That's a really interesting reward. How about this one? What do we tolerate? Because by the way, tolerating it silently is the same as as rewarding it. And so I think it really does have to be an active sort of stance. I will also tell you that this was like the experiment. And I have no idea how it happened, but I can tell you the story, which is I was blown away as the company scaled past the part where I know everyone's name, which is about 100, 120 people, right? Do your best, and that starts to waver. By 150, you're sunk. At least I am. And what I would be amazed by is I would walk by, groups of people working, and I would hear these things. Oh, well, our mission is to make vacation rental easy for everyone. Our vision, build the most trusted hospitality brand in this category. Value statements, and like I would see written work from people who I had never met, and they would be referencing these things. And I sort of wonder, like, how did that happen? And I suspect that it comes from instilling it from day one so that they were getting it from their peers, and that because eventually it can't be me. I can step back and continue to make sure we're drawing the edges, but that's about it.
So
When we get to you, sorry, you're.
I appreciate this drawing the box on a very subjective discussion, right? So how often are you reminding, communicating the edges to the team?
Like so much that they are so annoying. I mean, you saw 3 laughs over there. I mean, truly, like, to the point where I know that I'm getting an eye roll from some portion of the company. I've always believed that as a leader, you have to tell people what they need to hear, not what they want to hear. And by the way, I need the same thing. Part of the culture has to be tell me what I need to hear, not what I want to hear. That's really important, because telling me, what I want to hear is, that's fun, but it doesn't get us anywhere. So, I mean, honestly, it is a constant drumbeat, and some of that operationalization comes from like me, my language, what I'm rewarding. And when somebody, it happens all the time where there'll be a moment where I'll be in like a discussion and somebody will say something that's a very Cohat type of comment, and you can feel some of the people who are newer to the company go, how you gonna do that? Yeah. And I'm like, thank you so much. And reward that in the moment, and they see it. But yeah, I beat the drum until it's like practically broken on all this stuff, and we don't get very far in a conversation without pulling this into our language.
It's open, accurate, and direct.
Oh, communicate often, honestly, and directly is Cohat.
What was your biggest regret in the first 5 years? Culture.
Chasing growth. We ran into the problem that everyone thought we would have. These owners, it was a great idea, this model. You partner with these single property owners, you bring them on the platform. It's a classic aggregation of kind of small to medium-sized business thing. they were hard to find, and then you get them, and they only book a few tens of thousands of dollars, and we only get 10% of that, and right? And then we had these property managers who are already in this business, and they started to come to us and say, we got 50 units, we'll bring them on your platform, but they're not going to be exclusive, and you can't handle the pricing, and we're going to make sure the guest knows it's really our brand. And we're like, yeah, but there's 50 units. And we found ourselves saying yes and calling it a test. And the initial test worked, and we actually scaled that up and then realized one day, promise we're getting to your question, my man over here, so patient, thank you. We got to this place where we said, this business will get a lot bigger, a lot faster. It's also going to be really weak. We do not own an edge of the market. We don't own the guest. We're using a lot of distribution and Google and whatever. We don't own the owner. We only own the property manager as a customer. We are classically in the middle, and we are just waiting to get disintermediated and crushed. Our margin will get squeezed out. That's how markets work. And I felt like, and I remember having this conversation at a board meeting, I felt like we were going to be playing this game of musical chairs, and it was like this anvil hanging over our head. Like, we could have scaled the hell out of the thing, but it would all have been high carb revenue that could have gone away tomorrow. And if the music stops, you never know. And so we had this meeting with the board. We decided to unwind that strategy, pursue single property owners, even if it meant being ultimately a small company. But we wanted to be good. And this was one of the first really big COHAD moments was, unfortunately, we had to do a reduction in force. It was a third of the company, which at that time was 10 people. Most gut-wrenching thing you can do as a leader. Absolutely necessary. That was an entire part of the business built for those property managers. And then I said, here's the decision we made, here's why. Everyone, take your time today, go home. We're not talking business today about it. Tomorrow, come back, we'll talk business. And I got back in front of the company and said, okay, because we had these lofty growth plans, thousands and thousands and thousands of properties, right? And the next day we got back and I said, I want to show you the plan. This is in January. I want to show you the plan for the rest of the year. I had this slide, and it was January, 50, meaning 50 activations, right? 50 properties a month, which was like a tenth of the goal or whatever. And then February, 50. March, 50. November, October, November, December, 50. If we just go do 50 of the right units every month and prove we have a real business, we'll figure it out from there. We've got the capital to do that. We have the team to do that. That's what we're going to do. Man, everyone was like, all right, well, let's go do that. Guess what? By the end of the year, we're crushing 200 unit months, and that was literally the turning point that changed the whole trajectory of the business.
That's awesome.
Thanks for your patience.
Yeah. Well, so I'm connecting some dots, and it sounds like the culture came from you and your partner at the basement when the first thing started. And then you were the vanguard of that culture by having your parameters set up and building the organizations around that. And then now you're at the point where you realize that you've got a model that you want to share with other people so that it worked and it was a good thing. So if the culture originated from you, then does it stand to reason the higher minded you are, the more powerful and authentic and sustainable the culture is going to be, and beneficial for society at large because you're thinking about integration, you're thinking about inclusiveness. And so have you found within yourself that the more high-minded and noble you are, or even let's put it this way, if Martin Luther King or Gandhi or...
Oh, for God's sakes, man. I was already like, I'm not that high-minded.
Enters the short-term rental market. What do you know?
I'm just trying to book some vacation homes.
No, but do you get it? In theory, the bigger-minded you are, the more powerful the culture
Yeah.
will be. Is that true?
Yeah, and I don't mean to laugh. Thank you for that question. It's very sincere and you're patient. I just am obviously not going to actually accept any sort of.
But it sounds like that's what
I'm just trying
you
to.
are because of who you are. Then the culture is.
Yeah,
good.
I guess what I would say is this. I don't pretend to be in a position to be prescriptive about the edges anyone else should draw. I think that where I'll lean in and stay hungry and humble is one of our core values. And to be honest with you all, it's one that's very easy for me to live up to because oftentimes I don't want to kind of like lean out and say, I know the answer and here's the answer, right? I want to be more humble than that. That's my nature. I will say this. I am convicted everyone should start on day one, and this should be part of your business modeling. It is core and essential, and it is more important than all the other inputs in your beautiful model. Number two, you should draw your own edges, but that construct of, it's almost like minimum viable edges. What is it that gives the culture enough shape, enough structure that it can hold up to the hardest moments while giving your team all the freedom in the world to populate it with themselves, which is so important because it's not just that your team gets to do that, it's that, and not just that the new team members coming in get to do that. Because y'all have ever seen the companies too where it's like everything's glory days syndrome. It's all about the past. It's all about celebrating and revering this thing. That's the worst thing ever. Number one, that culture at 50 people doesn't work at 500 people anymore. You got to change and adapt. Number two, it's by definition exclusive. Like that's the one thing that your latest recruits can't access. They can never be a part of that. So you have to create something that they can be a part of. And then my last one for you is people grow and develop. I'm a different human being than I was 10 years ago. Now, I'd like to think that my core, some common denominator stuff is still there. But if I hadn't grown and developed personally and professionally in the last 10 years, given what I've been through on all those fronts, a parent, a husband, a son, a friend, and a CEO, man, that'd be the saddest thing I've ever heard in my life, right? So the culture has to have room for me to grow and develop so that I don't essentially grow out, or any one of us doesn't just grow out of the culture, because it's, it's like, I sort of think about, companies are just groups of people, so you can kind of break it down to like a human level. I don't mean to pick on any one person, so I'm sorry if somebody here is like this, but when you meet those people and like, it's only gonna take them 30 seconds for them to tell you how great they were at something in high school, right? Like, you don't wanna be that as a company, right? Like, you wanna be about what you need to be tomorrow, not what you were about yesterday.
And on
As
that
for
note,
the high-minded piece, man, I don't know. I try our best, but I think people should do what's right for them. And I think companies are, I will say, critically important components of society in helping to set where the edges are that we're all going to operate by as a culture and a norm, as a country, as a world. Like, I think companies have a role to play, and I think leaders of companies have an accountability to that. So yes, I do.
it's a great place to end. Thank you guys so much. This was a lot of fun. Thank you. It was great
Thank
to do
you.
this. Great
Thanks
to
for
share the
being here,
stage.
David.